the mic over to you if you don't mind, just to do a quick introduction. I'm going to unmute you. So if you can hear us, Simon, you want to give a quick kickoff for today's webinar?
Yeah, thanks, Rich. Good afternoon, everyone. This is the second in our series of our Azure webinars, specifically designed for K through 12. Today we're going to be talking about turnkey solutions for backup and disaster recovery. And I know from the people that we've got on the line that this has been of interest to a lot of you. So we'll also be recording this session. We'll be posting it on the website. The other thing as well, and I'll let Rich discuss this maybe at the end of the webinar, is we're looking forward to hosting you guys at the Ignite at K through 12 on the 7th of November. Rich, over to you.
Perfect. Thanks, Simon. Appreciate it. So I appreciate everyone taking the time today. So today's focus is, again, going to be on saving money while improving resiliency, turnkey backup and DR solutions using Azure Backup and Site Recovery. So if everyone hasn't attended last week's sessions or the sessions we did last year, my name is Rich Lilly. I am with partner, Netrix LLC. We're a primarily systems integrator, and I work specifically on the Microsoft stack, including Azure and a lot of what we're talking about today. Typically, I'm out in front of customers talking with these solutions and developing strategies, and then using our vast team to implement the solutions as well. Just some social info about me. You can find me on my website at cloudabove.com, on LinkedIn below, or feel free to heckle me on Twitter as well. And I should mention too, this is really part of a series, called Azure 123. So if you want to attend any of the other sessions, we do have 2 others coming up within the month of October, and you can find that information at azure123.rocks. So today we're going to cover 5 core concepts in about 45 minutes or so today. We'll leave some time at the end for questions. But we're going to start by just talking about backup versus DR. We're going to talk about backup with Azure Backup, backup with Data Protection Manager and other integrated solutions, disaster recovery using Azure Site Recovery, and then migration using Azure Site Recovery. So one of the first things that is absolutely key to talking about backup and DR is backup is not DR and DR is not backup. It is important to note that they are completely independent and separate activities, and you want to maintain them as such. You should never always consider backup and the ability of recovering a true DR scenario, and DR certainly isn't just copying your content over to a secondary site. DR is much more about the process as well. When we look at backups and DR, backups really focus on the recovery of data that was potentially inadvertently deleted. This could be due to malice type of intent or non-malice type of intent, but the goal is to recover data from a specific point in time. Most simple example is if we look at a user deleting a file off of a file share or deleting an email from an inbox. It's highly unlikely that you would want to turn up an entire Exchange server in order to recover just that one mailbox. The other side of that is, from a DR perspective, it allows us to recover in the event of an application or data center outage. So this is in the event that something like a natural disaster occurs, or a non-natural disaster like a power outage, or even things like storage failures or other things that can happen within the data center as well. So again, you ask yourself the question: would you ship tapes to a secondary site and build your apps from scratch, or would you want to actually provide recovery of whatever was active in production? Both of these concepts are going to be key as we talk about where Microsoft just kind of fit in their backup and DR solutions. So the first is really focused on talking about some of the Microsoft native backup solutions under Azure Backup. I should also point out that I don't have many slides in here, but there are multiple third-party solutions that plug directly into Azure as well. Some of the big name vendors out there that you may be aware of, such as Veeam, Commvault, Backup Exec, amongst a handful of others, do integrate directly with Azure in different ways. Some of them integrate directly with Azure Storage. Some of them require you to pull out virtual appliances, but most of the vendors have a mechanism and mean to integrate with the cloud. And certainly, when you look at things where like the cost of storage is in the cloud, that can be very advantageous for things like offsite backup. So when we think about the impact of digital data loss in your digital business, everyone's seen the reports. It seems like there's almost something weekly. But when we think about things like WannaCry, or the impact of your brand of losing customer data or partner data, or impacting student information, we certainly want to ensure that backups are at the core of your operational process today. When we look at most of the traditional approaches, and this really focuses on Azure type of approaches, but it's probably no different today than maybe on-prem backup solutions you have. This model explains kind of a traditional backup in Azure prior to Azure Backup was really focused on just backing up to Azure storage. Not really smart backups, not really stateful type of backups. Really wasn't overall the right approach. Also, traditional approaches are focused on things like using backup agents, which then back up to a central server, which then back up to Azure storage. These are again used across many of the storage vendors and offer some level of central management. But offer less scale from, at least when not Azure integrated, from a solution perspective. Now, Azure Backup as a whole really offers up, especially for Azure-based VMs, true backup as a service. No backup server, no backup VM that you have to maintain. It's all being done at the service layer through what's called ABS, or Azure Backup Service. In this case, for Azure-based deployments of VMs, whether they're deployed in test or prod or production, or even when you fail over resources from on-prem, you'll need a backup solution. Azure Backup is probably one of the easiest ways to manage backups in the cloud. A lot of the stuff that you would normally do with a traditional backup system is kind of hidden behind the scenes. So in this case, you can see that the servers in Azure actually use what's called a backup extension. And these services essentially talk to the Azure Backup Service. Kind of think of like the traditional backup agent-based model that's used today, but obfuscating that into a service level. That then talks to the data plane within Azure Backup, and then all the other pieces around management and data pruning and packing, all the stuff you typically are doing management tasks around today is actually completely automated in the background. Also, 2 weeks ago at Microsoft's Ignite conference, they also announced a new solution called Azure File Sync, which allows you to actually synchronize SMB-based file shares to the Azure cloud for backup. This allows for a policy-driven backup mechanism to the cloud without having a backup at a VM level. So this is, again, brand new, still in preview, I believe, but this is a method in which we can back up those data from, say, on-prem SMB shares where you may have a bulk of your unstructured data today. Also, I think that a lot of folks that are new to Azure and maybe public cloud in general don't recognize, specifically with Microsoft, their investment in open source. I believe the number today is somewhere around 60% of new resources built in Azure IaaS are actually Linux, not Windows. So as we recognize, many institutions have Linux-based solutions deployed today. Should point out that their Azure Cloud solution does fully support Linux backup-based solutions as well, as you can see here. And then we get to the important part. What happens when we need to restore? So in many cases, whether they're restoring VMs in the cloud or they're restoring VMs on premises, there's mechanisms in which we can pull that data back. With an Azure-based VM, we can just recover that VM to an explicit state. For on-prem, we can actually even recover those to new Azure VMs and attach the media just like it was on premises. So now you're not even bound by your data center or where it was in Azure. You really have the ability of taking this from anywhere to the cloud in the event of something that you can't recover in your data center. There are also various hybrid deployment models as well. So when we talk hybrid, we talk about cross data center, remote offices, stringed or backup chains. This allows us to back up on-premises workloads through a couple different means. This means not only physical servers like Windows or Linux, but also Hyper-V VMs. One that's commonly overlooked is VMware VMs. Microsoft has actually had VMware support in their backup solution for quite some time, even in their DR solution, which I'll talk about in a few minutes as well. This really allows you to centralize your backups if you so choose, or you can even take your remote branch offices directly to the cloud. That way you don't have to eat up your tunnel, your connection between your various campus locations. Typical model of what that would look like is something, and this is actually using back to a central location, but This is taking, say, a branch office, or in your case, a campus or location, backing up that information locally or to the cloud, but being able to take that all into one central repository. So we can take both the main data center, all our branch offices, without having to eat up any storage in our primary data center. Again, with the flexibility of the cloud, as I'll get to in a little bit, you can deploy this across many regions throughout the world. It's very unlikely that many of the institutions on the call would deploy in, say, the Germany cloud, but they're even across the domestic U.S. There's various locations and options that you can choose to take your data outside of just the region that you're resident in for DR purposes or for offsite backup purposes. Also, one of the most common questions I get is, we've got a lot of data today, so how do we effectively take 10 plus TB to the cloud, especially if you've had backups that have been seeded for quite some time. So there's a couple ways. Primarily up until a couple weeks ago, there was really one option to do so, and that was essentially purchasing a purchasing a set of drives from an approved vendor list from Microsoft, BitLocker encrypting those drives and actually shipping them to Microsoft through a service called ImportExport. And this allows you to import massive amounts of data that they then take directly off the drives into your tenant through one of the data centers where there's much higher speed connectivity than your internet connectivity. This is probably the most common. Nice thing is this does allow us to compress the data. So again, your backup data that's 10 plus TBs will be shrunk down to 30 to 40% lower than that, and then we can take that into the service and then resume the backups to the cloud once we've got that initial seed of data done. Microsoft made a very interesting announcement last week, and this is using a solution called Azure Data Box. So there's another vendor that I will remain unnamed that has somewhat of a similar solution that actually allows us to take a box that Microsoft ships to you, and you can actually back up content from multiple sources up to 100 TB to this device, and then you ship that back to Microsoft and they take it in. Again, before you were kind of limited it to drive sizes and you'd have to go acquire the drives and BitLocker encrypt them. Now Microsoft essentially has this box that they can ship you to take in these massive amounts of data. Again, up to 100 TBs for seeding specifically backup-based content here as well. So again, new solution that was just launched 2 weeks ago, but again, really great for getting your large backups into the cloud. Again, the nice thing about this, as I mentioned, you don't have to procure any disks. The parallel transfer, so this all happens in parallel with what's going on-prem, and then obviously safe and secure. So they've already done a lot of the heavy lifting that you had to do with some of the data import-export service in the past. Everyone should be familiar or somewhat familiar with system state backups. So again, all the Azure Backup agents support system state as well as Active Directory level, file level, server IS-based backups. So again, very important as we start talking about granular level recovery. And that is supported using the Azure Backup Agent as well. So again, even if you have on-prem systems today, especially in, say, campuses where there's only a file print and file, maybe web server, DC, you can actually just use one agent to get the domain, the Active Directory domain state, the web services, the file services, et cetera, including application level backups as well as a part of this. So again, just another means for you to not have to manage any type of local storage or tape drives, which is where a lot of folks still have in their edge campuses. Again, maybe not as relevant for the folks on the call today, but just to kind of talk about the breadth of the Azure cloud, these represent almost all of the Azure data centers. As you can see, there are quite a few in the U.S. to choose from. Just because you're in Illinois, Wisconsin, Indiana, et cetera, doesn't mean you have to deploy in the north central region. You may not want to ensure you have something outside the region in case of an event or something that may happen. So, certainly there's choices around West US, East US, South Central, even Canada, that you have options to choose from, essentially. So enough talking about the concept. What I want to kind of walk through is just kind of what this actually looks like. So here is the Azure portal itself. For those that haven't seen it or those who may have worked in the past, this is the Azure Resource Manager portal. So this is the ARM portal itself. If you've seen the older light blue interface, you'll probably recognize that as the old Azure portal, which will actually be deprecated. Specifically, this functionality I think is already being deprecated in that portal. But I've actually gone and created what's called a recovery services vault. So this recovery services vault actually performs multiple functions for me. It acts as a data point for my backups. It also houses all of my Azure Site Recovery data, which I'll walk through in a few minutes. But at the core, I want to just talk about how easy it is to take and back up a VM that's in the cloud. So again, I've got a brand new backup vault here. We can actually go down here and see what my backup policies are. I believe I just have one backup policy in here. So that backup policy today looks like it has a daily backup at 11 p.m. Sorry, I'm not sure where the time zone isn't selected there. With a retention of 30 days, so that's dailies for 30 days. We do weeklies for 52 weeks, so for a year. And then we also do weekly-based monthly backups, so just consistent snaps every 24 months. That's almost 2 years. And then we even do yearlies up to 99 years. So we effectively have 99 years worth of backups now within the cloud. So how easy is it to implement this? So once we define this policy, we just go over to the backup window here. We say, well, what exactly do we want to back up? So we want to back up from Azure-based resources or on-premises. So here we can add on-prem resources if we want to. In this case, we only have one option for the cloud called virtual machine. We choose our backup policy, which there's really only one here, so we'll just choose that from our dropdown. And then we're going to get a list of every VM that we have in Azure. So in this subscription, I have about 10 or 12. But what's interesting here is to add a new VM, I can literally just check the box, hit OK, and hit Enable Backup. I'm not going to do that for this one, but that's going to then start seeding the backup for that specific VM. Again, very, very easy to do, very easy to add. And if we go over into my backup items window, you'll actually see some other VMs I've got. Looks like 4 that are backing up in the cloud already. So here's a couple other test VMs I've got set up, and you can see here I've got a classic VM, a domain controller, a couple other VMs we can test from here as well. So the interesting thing is if I go over to one of these VMs, I can even initiate an instant backup if I want to. So maybe something's happening like a service backup upgrade or OS upgrade or patching, whatever have you, and I want to make sure I have a consistent backup ahead of time. I can go ahead and programmatically back that server up ahead of time. We can also do a restore from the VM. So this actually allows us to restore this Azure IaaS-based VM into a new instance in the cloud. And this may be because the existing VM is blue screened or won't power on or has an issue that's non-recoverable. So this actually would allow me to recover a new VM from that other state. Again, really no different than probably how you have recoveries configured for VMware, Hyper-V, et cetera, VMs on-prem today. What's also interesting is, let's just say I have just a bad file or a couple bad files or a deleted folder. I can actually now do folder-based or file-based recovery out of this console as well. So again, in the past, where you typically needed to deploy a full VM agent and have a full backup solution, even for Azure resources, I can now do file-level recovery from within the Azure console as well. So again, the options here are numerous. And again, if I wanted to add additional VMs here, I can go up to Add, and we'll walk back to that same interface. So really has a whole bunch of options here. The one that I didn't have a chance to set up prior to today's meeting is there's also, again, the ability of backing up on-prem workloads. And this would either be through an agent deployed on individual servers that would really be managed individually themselves, or you have the ability of deploying what's called Azure Backup Server, which is actually Microsoft took the guts of what used to be Data Protection Manager and uses that same interface, that same UI, the same mechanism to back up on-prem VMware, Hyper-V, physical, et cetera, resources. So that actually gives you, the very similar capabilities how you would have with any other enterprise-based backup solution, but all your policies are actually managed within the cloud. So again, a lot of options there for you to back up via different means. All right, so we're going to move on to disaster recovery now. So specifically, disaster recovery uses a Microsoft service called ASR, or Azure Site Recovery. So Azure Site Recovery is interesting. When we think about DR, the impact of an outage, just like the impact of not having backups, is bad for most businesses. In many cases, more enterprise level examples here, but what's the impact to your faculty and students if your server farm goes down or if your site goes down? Could be very, very impactful depending on the time of year and what's being done, and either way, it's going to be noticed. So having a good disaster recovery plan is key. The other thing we look at too is about 18% of global disaster recovery decision makers feel that they're prepared. I can't tell you how many clients I personally walked into, and they state they've got a DR plan but never tested it, and that, in my mind, is not an effective DR plan. And as you can see here, immature planning and limiting testing really, having out-of-date plans and not maintaining that well can mean a failure of DR, which is just as bad as not having DR in many cases. We also hear compliance needs as well. So even in the education market, where you're storing potentially sensitive content for students and faculty, we want to ensure that compliance is key. And if you are bound by any type of compliances, it's interesting to know that Microsoft has numerous compliances met up in the cloud that are kind of just out of the box versus some other institutions I've worked with had to go out and have their own auditors and processes that are fairly costly to do so, where this is just built into the cloud. So this is actually an interesting slide. I pulled this from one of the Ignite decks a couple of weeks ago, but this is actually a bar graph of the cost of significant disaster declarations. So interestingly enough, 56% of DR declarations are due to system failures. This is a bad hard drive fails an array, a bad server, a bad chip. Again, plentiful options there, but that is one of the most impactful DR declarations. We then look at power failure, whether it's due to natural disaster or other, being about 38%, natural disasters being 31%, and then about 19% being cyber attack, which is actually, interestingly enough, higher than I would have expected. But with kind of the world we're in today, we're seeing a lot more of that be common these days. So obviously, you want to think about planning for potentially at least one, but hopefully all of those types of scenarios with a proper DR plan. This is the fun slide. I mean, when I talk to customers about business continuity and disaster recovery, literally the number one thing that comes up every single time is cost. I always hear we've wanted to do disaster recovery, but our cost for a colo, our cost to put a data center in another campus, and pay for the power and the storage and the cooling and the storage, the virtualization licensing and backups, and that cost goes up. And it's a very, very high, in most cases, capital investment, especially for a warm or hot DR site. I would say quite a bit less for cold, but obviously your effectiveness of recovering from cold is going to be quite a bit poorer as well. The other thing we hear as well is the complexity. I know I've dealt with VMware for quite some time, and assuming a lot of the schools are VMware, and even if you're Hyper-V, there's going to be complexity involved with the process of failover and determining that. I've admin SRM before. I know it's not fun for those that have it deployed. So the difficulty for a lot of organizations is not just the cost, but how difficult it is to implement and maintain it. And then also we hear again back to some of the compliance needs as well, more in the enterprise space. So from an Azure perspective, I'm really going to walk you guys through kind of low cost of entry. The nice thing about leveraging a cloud resource is, in this case, the cost of the storage and the networking and the virtualization and the power and the cooling is just sunk into the service. And as you'll see, for a fairly low cost as well. Microsoft has really done a great job of reducing complexity and building out easy ways to recover and maintain these services so that you're not having to labor over spending hours and hours a day to get some of the stuff up and running and maintained. And then obviously compliance kind of out of the box. So there are quite a few options for Azure Site Recovery, and my guess is that one of these will apply to almost everyone on the call. So Azure Site Recovery does support DR for on-prem to on-prem scenarios as well. So this could be on-prem Hyper-V to on-prem Hyper-V. This would be applicable if you have two owned data centers today that are on two different campuses and you don't want to invest in the cloud just yet, but you need a good orchestration mechanism. ASR can perform that as well. In the same model, the second option is nearly the same, but actually supports SAN-based replication. So in some cases where you may have synchronous-based replication or asynchronous-based replication at the SAN level, there's full integration there. Now we start getting into some of the cloud scenarios. So Hyper-V to the cloud is just out of the box with Hyper-V. No special servers, no special agents. The Hyper-V VMs can actually talk directly to the cloud natively. Or using Virtual Machine Manager, they can talk the cluster of the cloud as well. Also, again, I would be remiss if I didn't mention VMware because they are a big player out there. But you can use this as a replacement for VMware to VMware or physical to VMware as well as VMware or physical to the Azure. So The only difference with option number 5 for those VMware customers out there is it does require you to deploy at least one server on premises as kind of a broker to talk to the cloud. But this is absolutely supported to replicate VMware-based VMs. We have quite a few customers doing that to the cloud as well. So don't just think this is limited to Windows servers and just on just Hyper-V. This is across other platforms and vendors as well. So the nice thing is ASR actually serves multiple functions. So one, it is a disaster recovery tool. So, and that's primarily why we're talking about it today. Allows us to actually define recovery plans and failover VMs in order and do tests as a part of the failover. Also, though, Microsoft positions Azure Site Recovery as a migration tool. So if you use ASR in under 31 days for a VM, it's actually free. So if you have a bunch of workloads that you're looking to move to the cloud, you can use ASR to do so, and there's no cost from a service level of doing that other than your VM running in the cloud. Microsoft, for those VMware customers that are really looking to migrate workloads from on-prem VMware as well, 2 weeks ago at Ignite, Microsoft announced a project called, I believe, Azure Migrate, and that actually allows for assessment, right-sizing, and migration of VMware-based resources to Azure, all in one fell swoop of a tool. So I don't have any slides in this deck because it's very, very new. I don't know if it's actually out yet, but some really cool stuff that Microsoft is doing there. Then last but not least, maybe not a common scenario people would think about for ASR is dev test. So what happens if I want to just test my on-prem environment in the event of a failover, but maybe not failover itself? Or what if I need to do a service pack upgrade or do an application upgrade? Why not fail that over to the cloud, bring up the snapshot, and from a very specific point in time, install those, make sure it works, and then tear it down without ever having to touch production. Again, where there may be constraints on capacity or the availability of specific resources, that's really an area where Azure Site Recovery can play a really good role as well. So when we look at application DR with Azure Site Recovery, there are various layers. First of all, when we talk about doing DR to the cloud in Azure, we are typically recommending that you always have at least one domain controller online in Azure. And this would be no different than you having another data center, another branch office, specifically to have local authentication. And in the event your primary site went dark for any reason, you'd want the ability to ensure that users can still authenticate. So that's something that is typically kind of like an always-on resource in the cloud, or ideally one or two. We also have the ability to replicate content to the database, web, or app tiers. So consider this application consistent replication, that actually allows us to reduce our amount of potential data loss, even for things like SQL, for file servers, et cetera, that have VSS writers. And that's all integrated with ASR as well. This is just another example. This is more of a hot model where we may have a SQL always-on instance replicated to the cloud as well, but again, allows us to have more online resources at any time. Models like this would almost always require at least a site-to-site tunnel connection to Azure, or in some cases may necessitate things like express route through, say, an I2 connection. Again, we talk about compliance and security. Microsoft has some of the most stringent security and compliance controls in the cloud. HIPAA, EU data protection, CSA, PCI. Not all these relevant in the EU sector, but they've made significant investments in ensuring that they have a privacy out of the box type of scenario for the cloud. So again, depending on even if you're not bound by any of these, it may still be important for you to make sure you meet a specific subset of security and compliance in the cloud. And, again, a lot of that is just out of the box with Azure. So the next couple slides just walk through the architecture of what just DR looks like in a couple examples here. So one of these, which actually I'll have in my demo in just a minute, is the Hyper-V disaster recovery to the cloud. So in this model, with no live domain controllers, this actually just replicates over outbound 443, meaning you don't have to open up any special firewall ports to deploy any special servers. You can literally just set up Hyper-V to connect directly to Azure and start replicating your workloads on-prem today. Now that can either be done through individual Hyper-V hosts or it can be done through your virtual machine manager instance in the cluster itself. So the option here, again, just allows you to do this with very, very low time to implement and high time to value. So the goal there is to essentially just make this easy to light up for those customers that are based on Hyper-V. Now, VMware works a little bit differently. So for those that are VMware customers on-prem today, Microsoft does require you to deploy, and these can actually be combined now in a single server, depending on the sizing. But there's these roles called the process and configuration server. The process server actually just houses the cache data from the VMware storage and tracks the changes for any new changes that are happening in the Azure data stores. The configuration server is just used for centralized management. So this is kind of the management point. And again, depending on the size of the deployment, these can actually be combined into one role. But again, you see here that we don't actually have to have a site-to-site tunnel or express route configured to Azure. This actually just connects directly over a public-facing endpoint over 443 directly to your tenant. So again, time to deployment here, a little bit more because we need to deploy some servers as a requirement. But again, outbound 443, open in most institutions, very, very easy to get that up and running and starting to test disaster recovery. Okay, so let's just take a look at a couple examples of what this looks like for disaster recovery. So we're going to go back to the same Azure Site Recovery Vault I have in here. And as you saw earlier, I was in this backup pane. We have a separate pane down here called replicated items. Now, I've gone ahead and done some legwork, and in your case, it may be one of three scenarios. I either deploy an agent to a Hyper-V host, I deploy an agent connection with Virtual Machine Manager, or I deploy the process and configuration server for VMware. In any one of those scenarios, you then have the ability, once those are up and running, to essentially pick any VM from on-premises. So I happen to have a Hyper-V cluster on-prem, so we're going to show what it looks like just to add a new Hyper-V VM. So in this case, we can see the source either on-prem or Azure, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. Our source location is System Center Virtual Machine Manager, and I've got a demo cloud in VMM here, which wouldn't be applicable to, say, VMware or just Hyper-V server standalone. Now here we choose where we want that target to be. So I'm not going to go much into this today, but in Azure there's subscriptions that are kind of boundaries. We can choose the post-failover resource group, which is just a logical grouping of resources, how we want to deploy it, and then what storage account it's going to go into. So I'm actually going to leave all those to default because I already have them configured for this, this vault. And then we simply choose our VMs. So I want to point out that these VMs, 5 pages of them, I think about 40 VMs, all are just VMs that are on my Hyper-V infrastructure. So if I wanted to go back up my NDES server or my configuration manager server, my SharePoint server, this is literally as simple as checking a box, and it's going to go tell, in this case, VMM, or tell Hyper-V that, hey, I need to start backing up that item. So you can also see here that it automatically selects the operating system based on what's discovered from the VM on-prem. In most of these cases, I only have one disk except for Configuration Manager, which I have a C drive as well as a data drive for all my distribution point content. But there may be cases where you don't want to replicate drives. Like, for instance, you don't always want to replicate the SQL temp DB volume. You may not always want to replicate backup volumes. So in here, we have the ability of checking or unchecking various disks that we want to replicate up into the cloud as well. So again, kind of have your choice here as well. So then we're going to hit OK. And then the last option is just setting a replication policy. Now, I already have a replication policy configured. So what we do is we do a copy every 15 minutes. So what happens is locally in VMware and the VMware servers that we deployed, or in Hyper-V or in VMM, it actually tracks all the changes that are made for that duration. And this duration can be as low as 30 seconds, which is very interesting because that allows for very low RTOs. There's also the recovery point retention. So in this case, we have the ability of recovering up to data every 2 hours. And then we also do an application consistent snapshot every hour. Now, we choose to seed ours immediately. You may choose not to do this or do it on a different schedule. I'm not going to actually hit OK on this, so we won't do all that today. Otherwise, it will start to flood our upload pipe on our internet connection. And we have the option of encrypting the content when it's being written to the cloud as well. So I did not hit enable there, but I already have a couple of other VMs enabled here in this case. And just to kind of walk through what they look like, I've got 2 VMs on premises, and these represent what that looks like after the fact. So we're just going to choose one of our VMs here. And I want to point out that we have a couple options. So one thing, we see the vault it's in, the storage, we can see what network it's connected to. We can see what size it mapped to in the cloud. So in this case, it said, okay, well, you're about the same size as a basic A1, which again, it will make recommendations for you. We can see the replication is currently healthy. It is protected, no events. and the last recovery point was crash consistent at 10:13 at 12:28, so less than 10 minutes ago. And I don't have app consistent turned on for this one because there's no apps in here that I'm really concerned about. If I did want to modify any of the settings to the VM, like how much compute and network it was using, we do have the ability of going over here into the VM and saying, well, when we do recover this, it shouldn't be an A1. That's not quite big enough. So maybe we need something with a little bit more beef. So, or maybe we want to recover it with a little bit less because we're not worried about performance, but more just about making sure that it gets brought up. And down here, you see the network property. So this represents the VMs, the network on premises, excuse me, the network in Azure, and then the target subnet, which I've got an internal DMZ and a WAF here. And then I may choose to give this an explicit IP as well. So again, all of these allow us to really define what that VM is going to come up with when it comes online. And then similarly on the disk size here too, you can see just all the disks. I only have got one associated with this, but again, just see what that status is. So individually, we have a couple different options here. So for this VM up top, you can see that I can actually do a planned failover. Now, a planned failover would be that I know an event is going to occur, so I want to make sure there's no data loss, and I'm going to recover everything in a controlled manner. If I were to hit planned failover here, we'd say that, I haven't done a test failover in the last 180 days, so I say yes. I'm not going to fail over, but you can see it's failing over from VMM to Azure. And then if I were to fail that VM over, that would be up, and I think this one takes about 4 or 5 minutes, maybe 6, to actually bring that VM up in the cloud. The planned failover, though, what that does is in our Hyper-V instance or in VMware, it's going to cleanly shut down the VM, migrate all the final changes that were made to those disks, and then bring that VM up in the cloud. So again, zero data loss. Again, really relevant if you know there's an event that's going to occur. A failover is not that. A failover allows us to actually take a specific point in time and bring this VM up. So I don't have any other recovery points. Oh, actually I do. Sorry, I've got one. So this actually allows me to say, well, I want to choose the lowest RPO or the lowest RTO. So looks like there is a separate time here, but I can choose the 1228 crash consistent backup and actually bring that VM up. Now, in some cases, I won't have the ability of shutting down the VM, but this may also be relevant if I need to bring a VM up from a previous state due to like a blue screen or a bad service pack application or such. And then the last option, which you've seen it bark at me a couple of times for, is this test failover. Now, the cool thing here is I can actually bring this up in a private non-routable VLAN in Azure. So I can actually fail over this test VM in its current state without ever touching production. So here we can take that time from 1228 or the lowest RPO, and this VM actually comes up in a consistent state from whatever that last RPO time was. Again, never touching production, which is why I don't put it back to my VNet, which is actually connected back to my site-to-site tunnel. The last thing we would want is two VMs up with the same names, the same information on the same network. So this is why we actually can bring up not only one, but we can bring up entire environments and test environments without ever impacting production, which is a big drive away from the where DR has really been in the past, where I actually have to fail things over. In this case, this gives you an option of not having to do so. And then on this last option here, we have the ability of doing disabling replication. One option that's that you can't see here that's not highlighted because I didn't fail this VM over, there's also this option called reverse replicate. So in the event I actually fail something over with no data loss to Azure, and let's say you can still communicate with the on-prem environment, I can actually fail that VM back just as easily. So when I do fail a VM over, it actually automatically initiates reverse replication so that any changes that I make in the cloud actually replicate directly back on-prem. So I can actually fail that over without having to wait to seed back the 50, 100 plus gig content. So again, just a couple of options there. The other thing, and that's more looking at the individual VM. Since we're in here, the other thing I'll walk you through really quickly here is the site recovery plans. This actually allows you to create a coordinated action of failover. So this is actually just a simple recovery plan that I built for our environment here, and it's just failing over 2 VMs. But this recovery plan defines the entire process, the entire technical process. So first it shuts down all the VMs, then it brings up the 2 VMs in the cloud, and then it starts the VMs. Now I can also add pre and post failover actions. So for instance, if I wanted to run a script to check that a service is running, if I wanted to check that a registry setting is there, if I want to restart a service 5 times, I can do that. You can set these actions so that you can automate stuff that you would typically have to do from a check perspective, active DR actions. Or I can even put a manual action here and say, okay, well, I need a tech to go ping this, or I need them to go launch this service. You can actually build even the manual steps into your runbooks here as well. Again, the nice thing here, much like I showed you on the individual VM side, is I can actually go over here and I can run that entire process. So, think about a scenario you may have 20, 50, 100 plus VMs. You can actually build out your entire recovery plan here and fail everything over in one fell swoop versus piece by piece. And again, reverse replicate, fail back, etc., are all there as well. The biggest word of warning I can give you is just to ensure that you have a good maintenance process if you're going to maintain this. As you remove VMs on-prem or add VMs, change sizes and such, it's very important for you to make sure you maintain this infrastructure as well. And we actually offer a service around that for those that don't quite think they can keep up with their on-prem workloads. So that's actually all I want to show you, I think, from the console here. So I have just a couple other slides, and then we'll probably be ready to close here. Actually, I do have one more thing. So last week, or 2 weeks ago at Ignite, Microsoft also announced a new offering, which is actually failing VMs over between Azure regions. So prior to this announcement, if you had an Azure VM in one region and you wanted to do DR, there was really nothing you could do other than replicate the storage account and then create a process to create a new VM and attach that disk in the event of an event. So Microsoft extended their Azure Site Recovery service to now replicate between 2 different Azure regions. So everything we talked about we can do with on-premises, we can also do between Azure, especially for those folks that may already be using Azure for other workloads. So in this case, I deleted a couple of VMs in here, but if we actually go down to our other Azure to Azure recovery vault here, this is actually backing up from US East, I believe, to US West. And these VMs don't exist anymore, but this is actually just the same process for replicating VMs between sites. So again, the only difference here is instead of choosing my source as my source is on premises, I choose Azure, where the source location is. So we'll pick North Central. I think I've got another VM in there. Select our resource group. Actually, I don't think I have any here, but we'll go through part of the process here. There probably won't be any VMs here, so there's not. But then again, very similar to the on-prem process, is I just check the box for the VM, and I can now replicate that VM consistently across 2 different sites. Again, a huge add for very low amount of effort for site-to-site disaster recovery in Azure. I think we've actually gone through all of these. Again, the biggest thing is that the migration for Azure Site Recovery is no different than what I've already showed you. The only difference is just make sure you replicate it for less than 31 days. And if you want to take those workloads from on-prem to the cloud, again, that processor license to do so is essentially free. The other best takeaway I can kind of give you here as well is I get a lot of questions around, what does it take to get to the cloud? How much is it going to cost? The great thing is Microsoft has priced this very aggressively, and even though they cut the price of this service in half earlier in the year, I believe this year. So the list price for DR for one VM today from on-prem to the cloud is only $25 per VM per month. That is very low, even when you consider potential 100 VMs versus the potential capital expenditure of power and cooling and location and storage and networking, et cetera. So the biggest thing that we come back to the biggest thing I hear from customers on the barrier of entry being cost, this really opens up the possibilities to really provide a true DR solution without having to invest a very large amount of money to do so or piecemeal something together. And certainly again, as Simon will attest to, with your Azure minimum monthly monetary commit, for those that didn't attend my last session, which is about $100 per month, that can actually give you DR for up to 4 virtual machines in the cloud, and that's for the minimum amount of agreement to add to your campus agreement. So absolutely reach out to Simon and team to talk about what those options look like, especially if you're interested in moving into Azure for disaster recovery. So I'm going to leave the last few for questions, but my last ask is we do have 2 upcoming sessions here. Next week we have a session who is delivered actually by one of our development folk members. So that specifically is on developing new capabilities for your district with cloud app development. And then we'll be putting on a final session on October 27th, which is learning how deploying workloads in the cloud can increase your security posture. So a little bit more focused on the security side of it than just kind of the basic DR or some of the 101 sessions I've done in the past. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up, I'm going to unmute the audience, and for anyone that wants to speak up, unmute, or put any questions in the chat window, I'd be happy to use the rest of this time to answer any questions you have. Just bear with me 1 second. So I'm going to unmute, so anyone that wants to pipe up and ask a question, feel free, or again, the chat window is open to IM anything you may have as well. And then, yep, and Simon, thank you for the reminder. So again, this year we're actually putting on a new event. So actually Netrix is hosting this with Microsoft support. Last year we did an event for higher ed in the Microsoft Aon Center downtown. And this year we're actually extending that through K through 12. So November 7th is an event specifically tailored at technology for K through 12. It's called Ignite at EDU. And then it'll be an all-day mini conference of what Ignite put on 2 weeks ago. So we've got a whole bunch of different tracks. If you don't have an invite for that already, please feel free to reach out to Simon and he can get you a copy of that. But we'd love to see as many of you there as possible. We'll have some really great tracks, some really great discussions, some vendors to talk to around a lot of the stuff we've talked about today, as well as a lot of the rest of the Microsoft stack. And Simon, Simon just put that in the chat window for any of those that didn't have that link prior.
This video will be recorded as well and we'll be posting on the www.azure123.rocks website.
Yes, thank you, Simon. Yep, we'll have the deck and the recording out hopefully by Monday as well. All right, well, if there are no more questions, I do appreciate everyone taking time out of their Friday to join me today. Again, feel free to reach out to Simon directly after myself, and appreciate the time. Simon, any closing words?
No, I'm just watching the IM window at the moment. I didn't know if Brian had a question. John, thank you for taking your time. I know you're a busy guy, so I appreciate it. Maybe not. Okay.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Have a great weekend, and appreciate the time. Look forward to seeing you on the next call.